Are Vulcans the logical, cool big brothers of the galaxy, or are they really the violent, deceptive, mass-murdering bullies they seem to look down on? In the world of Star Trek, Vulcans have a reputation for having the coolest heads in the entire galaxy. They're so stoic that it annoys many of their coworkers and friends.
You're out of your Vulcan mind, Spock.
But it wasn't always that way. Early Proto-Vulcan society was defined by intense violence, uncontrollable emotions, and bloody, potentially world-ending warfare. Given the psychic powers and sheer physical strength of Vulcans, this state of war was a brutal affair. Vulcans didn't end up bombing each other into oblivion, so what happened?
We disposed of emotion, Doctor.
Negative.
Where there's no emotion, there's no motive for violence.
Just when things seemed to be on the edge of annihilation, the philosopher Surak championed the ancient idea that the strong emotions felt by all Vulcans were at the core of their troubles. Controlling those feelings with a rigid framework of logic was, to Surak and his followers, the only answer. This period was called the Time of Awakening, and in Earth time it happened around the 4th century. Surak's teachings weren't universally adopted, but they did eventually become the predominant mode of thought on the planet Vulcan. Many Vulcans left the planet, and over time, others that didn't adhere were ostracized, outcast, and punished. Most Vulcans rededicated themselves to peace, science, and galactic exploration, at least on the surface. Eventually, they became one of the 4 founding species of the United Federation of Planets. Humans and Romulans have a difficult past. The Earth-Romulan War, a key event in the Star Trek timeline, was a major 22nd century conflict that kicked off when humanity became an important power in the Alpha Quadrant of the galaxy. The general issue was that the humans, along with the other future founding species of the Federation, wanted to make alliances and explore. The Romulan Star Empire, on the other hand, wanted to conquer the galaxy. The war was highly destructive, finally ending with a tenuous peace agreement and the formation of the Neutral Zone, an area of space that acted as a buffer between the Romulans and the Federation. The whole existence of the Romulan Star Empire is kind of the Vulcans' fault. In broadcast terms, it began with the original series episode Balance of Terror, in which we first see the Romulans, when the crew of the Enterprise can't help but notice that they look an awful lot like their Vulcan First Officer Spock. Later episodes acknowledge that Romulans were once the Proto-Vulcans that left Vulcan during the era of Surak. Having refused a path of pacifism, Romulans leaned extra hard into their violent tendencies and established their own territory-hungry empire. Over the course of thousands of years, Romulans evolved into the worst of what Vulcans could be, calculating, cold, and merciless. The similarities between Vulcans and Romulans would play a big part in many subsequent Star Trek stories. Aside from their violent cousins, early Vulcans created other serious issues for their descendants. Enter the Stone of Gaul. The stone is a superweapon that they split into 3 pieces and hid during the Time of Awakening, and it becomes an issue during the Next Generation 2-parter The Gambit. The Stone of Gaul had one purpose: to boost Vulcan mind powers so that they can kill with a thought. And during the time of Captain Picard, an isolationist sect of Vulcans are looking for it.
A group that believes contact with alien races has polluted our culture and is destroying Vulcan purity.
And the agent looking for the stone? She's a Vulcan masquerading as a Romulan, so much for being brutally honest pacifists. Eventually, Picard realizes that the Stone of Gaul doesn't harm its target if the target is peaceful. Vulcan security forces ultimately take the weapon and promise that it will definitely, for sure, be destroyed. But Vulcans are way more sneaky than they'd like you to think. The original series episode Spock's Brain is notorious for being the series' worst and weirdest episode. The Enterprise is boarded by a mysterious woman who takes off with Spock's brain, which is basically needed to run a supercomputer that oversees their society. Spock's still functioning body is left behind, though Dr. McCoy says it will die after 24 hours. No problem though, they just weekend at Bernie's Spock's body with some fancy remote controls and go after the brain. After a convoluted series of events, Spock's brain is reinstalled, the society is probably fine anyway, and the Enterprise sails off.
Brain and brain! What is brain?
Some fans view it as a complete disaster of goofy concepts and poor execution. Others defend the campy story and note that maybe obsessively ranking episodes and arguing over the results isn't the best use of time anyway. But you have to consider the weird side of Vulcan physiology revealed here. After the brain heist, most of Spock is left behind to sort of stumble around while wearing a silly hat. He's a zombie with an RC controller, and it's a concept so notorious in Trek lore that they visited again in Deep Space Nine as an intentional comedy. Spock comes out of it just fine, but the fact that a Vulcan can survive without a brain is just creepy as heck. For a while there, Vulcans looked like they were going to be a bunch of uptight but well-intentioned nerds who were ready to help out humanity's first steps into space. Their disdain for humans was always apparent, but it became even more clear during the prequel series Enterprise. Set in the few years before the United Federation of Planets was formed, the series depicts the crew of the first Starship Enterprise, captained by Jonathan Archer. That crew included Sub-Commander T'Pol, a Vulcan official who acted like a babysitter of the humans and informant to the Vulcan High Command. T'Pol became a more human-friendly character over time, but it became clear that Vulcans knew a lot more than they were sharing. They believed that humans were too impulsive and immature to be given free rein in space, so they hid information and occasionally sabotaged human advancement by just refusing to help.
You did everything you could to sabotage our mission. I got more help from the Andorians than I ever got from the High Command.
Sure, humans would almost certainly have had a rougher time if they didn't have Vulcan backup, but any help given was ultimately done with a big dose of pity. It also becomes pretty clear that humans were just kept around like pets because they were fun for Vulcans to watch, with multiple episodes revealing that Vulcans had already visited Earth well before officially making first contact. But it's a kind of fascination that's pretty demeaning. First mentioned in the animated series episode Yesteryear, the Vulcan Kazwan ritual marks a young Vulcan's entrance into adulthood. Vulcan children are sent out into their planet's vast desert to see if they can make it for a period of time without supplies. The animated series kind of played with the rules of Star Trek very loosely. For one, the Guardian of Forever portal that sent Kirk and Spock back to 1930s Earth and the city on the edge of Forever comes back, but this time it's easier to control, and it allows Spock to jump back into his own past with no problem. While there, he saves his younger self from certain death during the dangerous ritual. But even if you don't respect the canon established by the animated version of Star Trek, it's mentioned again in Enterprise when T'Pol fondly remembers her own Kazwan experience. Even though there were hints of shadiness, one of the first major dents in the Vulcan reputation for total honesty came in the premiere season of Enterprise with the Andorian incident. There, the crew of the Enterprise gets involved in a touchy situation at a Vulcan monastery on the planet P'Jem. When the Enterprise crew arrives, they find Andorians holding the monks captive. The Andorians say the Vulcans are using the monastery as a spy base, which sounds ridiculous, until the crew uncovers a massive surveillance operation in the basement. On the positive side, having a common frenemy marks one of the first signs of unity between the humans and Andorians.
We're in your debt.
But it gets worse. The fourth season episode The Forge shows that Vulcans aren't above killing humans and framing their own. Here, a sect of fundamentalist Vulcans called Sirenites are considered to be a threat to their own people, mostly because they adhere to the original teachings of Surak and not what they become over the years. When they're blamed for the bombing of the United Earth Embassy on Vulcan, it seems like they might be terrorists, except it turns out that they've been framed by the authoritarian government. It's hardly a point in favor of Vulcans. Vulcan mind melds are incredibly awkward. Not only is there all kinds of weird face touching, but seeing the most private corners of someone else's mind can get pretty gross. If you've ignored pop culture for the past 60 years, a mind meld is a deep psychic connection between two beings in which they can basically see each other's minds. It's been used to get insight into someone's motivations, to offload extra emotions, heal mental trauma, and in the best cases, to share a deep bond between people. But what if one of the participants isn't exactly willing? In Enterprise, the Season 1 episode Fusion notes that Vulcans themselves aren't always comfortable with the mind meld. When the Enterprise makes contact with a Vulcan ship, they realize that the occupants don't really believe in the traditional Vulcan logic or emotionlessness. At one point, a Vulcan named Teleris tells Enterprise's T'Pol that mind melds might be useful in engaging with emotions, even though the practice has gone out of fashion. When they attempt to mind meld, T'Pol asks to stop, only for Teleris to persist, and in the process he gives her a neural disease by performing the ritual wrong. It's also painful to watch the mind meld between Spock and Lieutenant Valeris at the end of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. The connection reveals that Valeris is a traitor and a murderer, like so many Vulcans somehow seem to be. She very clearly does not consent to the procedure. And Dr. McCoy doesn't clearly consent to host Spock's Katra, which is basically his soul, at the end of The Wrath of Khan, which ends up being pretty troubling for McCoy, but ultimately saves Spock's life. But no matter what, reaching your sticky fingers into someone's mind is something that everyone needs to agree to.